And it's very important for the leaders or presumed leaders in any group to straighten out those troublemakers.
Supplementary.
In October of 1978, after 18 months of fruitless negotiations, postal workers voted to strike. After one day of legal strike, the Canadian government passed Bill C-8, ordering the postal workers back to work. Despite this legislation, postal workers across the country maintained their right to strike for another 8 days.
The postal workers were simply exercising a right that had been given to them, the right to free collective bargaining and the right to strike in order to win a better contract. And they had been without a contract for a period, I believe, of some 18 months. They didn't create the problem. It was the approach to bargaining taken by the employer, the federal government, that really caused the problem. It was the frustration that caused the postal workers to react as they did, and to lay charges against them for defiance of legislation, to drag them through the courts, and to raid their offices by the RCMP is very close to bordering on a police state tactic.
This repression is the result of government strategy, which has always been to compel the union to fight for a collective agreement.
We want a contract! We want a contract! We want a contract!
Over the last 10 years, the government has developed this position: no negotiations without a strike. As Bryce Mackesy himself said in 1975,
sometimes a good long strike is what's needed in an industry. It sometimes brings an end to an awful lot of small illegal work stoppages, or a series of legal work stoppages. And maybe what we need is what we've had in other European countries, a good long post office. Once and for all, we can sit down, both feel the economic pressures, and sit down and solve our issues.
Well, in 1975, our employer took the same approach to the 1975 negotiations as he did with the all other rounds previous to 1975. The stand was that they just weren't ready to negotiate with the union, and they never seemed to be ready until such time as the union was in a position to have a mandate to call a strike. We got our mandate in October from the members, and in the 3 days following the mandate, the employer signed 3 times the number of clauses with the union as he signed in the previous 9 months.
but back in 1975, it still took a bitter 42-day strike to get a collective agreement. One of the issues central to the strike was the use of casual labor in the post office.
Les postiers étaient opposés à l'utilisation des employés occasionnels parce que les employés...
Postal workers were opposed to the use of casual workers because casuals are cheap labor, and by law, they can't be in a union. We must also remember that the casuals have affected the rights of postal workers. Since 1960, postal workers have had to work nights while casuals were put on the day shift. Postal workers had to take their vacations in autumn or in the winter, while casuals were off in the summer. Overtime was given to casuals instead of regular employees.
The 1975 collective agreement gave the union some protection against the use of casuals. Article 29 of that agreement also gave postal workers the right to be consulted on the implementation of technological change and a guarantee that no jobs would be lost as a result of automation. Postmaster General Blay gave the following assurances.
When I look at Clause 29, I say that the Post Office has signed that agreement on behalf of Treasury Board, that it will honor the terms of that particular agreement, that to my knowledge, and I can guarantee that there has not been, since the signing of that agreement, any reduction of manpower in the Post Office as a result of technological change.
But despite promises, the government refused to consult the union on technological change and never intended to live up to the agreement it had signed.
But the employer is trying to go around this collective agreement by saying that most of the changes he introduced are not technological change, which make it that the job security do not apply. So that's the difficulty we are facing. Already there have been people that have been laid off on the basis that the employer said the changes were not technological change. So we're trying.
The problems in the post office go back much farther than the issue of automation and the use of casual labor. They are as old as the post office itself. In a country as vast as Canada, postal service has always been a vital link. Throughout the years, hundreds of thousands of postal workers have worked to move our mails with skill and efficiency. Like other public sector employees, postal workers did not have the right to bargain collectively and to strike. It was in these years that the government mentality in relation to postal workers developed. Thoughtless and harsh control for control's sake. In 1965, 17,000 postal workers voted to stop work for 17 days. They won the right to strike for themselves and for the entire federal public sector. But it wasn't until 1968, after a 3-week strike, that the 24,000 postal workers and letter carriers won their first collective agreement. Throughout the following years, the government continued to act as it had before the union was formed. The rights won through strikes and negotiations were ignored. In the early 1970s, automation was introduced, and along with it, a new corporate image.
Having moved into the post office, Mr. Corkery from de Havilland, having brought in the other guy that's now gone on to another department from IT&T, having brought in Mr. Paré from Steinberg's via Princeton or wherever in the United States, having brought them in with their business mentality, the postmaster now is going to be the tough guy. He's going to run the post office like a business, hopefully to convince the public sector, the corporate sector out there, that we've got a tough minister in charge, and things are going to start rolling along, and hopefully there'll be some financial support for the Liberal Party when the bagman goes calling.
They can't make a decision. It's basically a political department of the government, and used as a political football by the MPs in the House, and they just refuse to make the service better. And maybe they've had bad people at the top. I don't say maybe, I say they have had bad people at the top at the decision-making level, and they refuse to address the problems of running a national communication system.
The government had planned to spend $97 million on automation. The cost, in fact, surpassed $1 billion. Despite this enormous investment, mail service did not speed up or improve.
Automation may provide improved efficiency, or it may not. It depends upon whether the investment that is undertaken is efficient or not. In the case of the post office, it has done a considerable amount of automation, but a lot of it has been very inefficient. It has failed to adapt and use modern telecommunications technology in the supply of services, and is therefore suffering in comparison with telecommunications companies and data processing companies.
Aside from inefficient investment, the post office treated with contempt the workers who would have to operate the cumbersome and complex machinery.
Our employer, the first thing he did in introducing automation was to declassify the postal workers that were doing the work manually and say, doing the work with a machine, you'll be paid 75 cents less. So surely it was not the best way to get the cooperation of the union in the automation program.
In addition to undermining the collective agreement by the unilateral introduction of technological change, management, from the lowest supervisor to the postmaster general, pursue a deliberate policy of undermining morale by continually engaging in public attacks on postal workers.
Direct the question to the Postmaster General regarding the chaotic and unacceptable state of affairs in the post office, for which the postmaster is blaming workers and not management. Now, it's been reported that the postmaster recently stated that he could make the post office run efficiently if he could only fire 500 workers. Now, Mr. Speaker, all I want to know is what is the background for that statement? Has he a list of names of these 500 persons and the unions to which they belong, or was this just public posturing in order to cover up the ineptness of the post office management?
Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable members should understand better what I said when I stated that if I had to do something and a question was asked by a newspaper man asking me how many people you think you could get rid of if you want a post office to work smoothly. I said 500, the same thing I could say 100, or we could say 1,000. It was...
A thing I feel that is really bad is the way our top representatives like Lamontagne will get up in Parliament and say that we're all stealing from the mail and sleeping on the job and things like that. That really makes me feel so resentful, because I take a little bit of pride in not being that type of a person. I really have quite a good old work ethic. And I think most of us do. We like to do a good day's work, but when you're sort of slandered like that, you feel a little bit like saying, well, to heck with you, buddy.
I've had supervisors tell me that to play the game, that's the exact words that I was given, play the game. You're not supposed to question whether or not there's a slowdown of the mail in a certain position, or whether the mail is not going out quickly enough, whether mail's stuck in a corner and may have been sitting there for a week. You're not there to question that. The supervisor's not interested. He's only interested in picking up his double time, his overtime, his money, his paycheck, and he's not at all interested in the problems of the post office or in the problems of the worker.
Il y a certains exemples des abus de mesures disciplinaires au poste qui sont effarants.
In 1974, 200 to 300 employees came to work wearing T-shirts saying boycott the postal code. They did this because they had no protection against technological change. The supervisors thought they could suspend everyone, so 200 to 300 people were sent home, resulting in a 2-week strike. The irony was that when the matter was settled, according to the return to work procedures, no disciplinary measures were taken. Nonetheless, this shows what kind of relationship exists between the supervisors and the employees. And this relationship, by necessity, can't lead to sane human relations, much less a productive work atmosphere.
The only way to protect the rights in a collective agreement is through the grievance procedure. We have been able to convince our members to grieve, and as a matter of fact, the grievances that we've taken to the limit to adjudication, we have won 75% of those grievances. We've had 65,000 grievances filed by our members, and since we have 23,000 members, that's approximately 2.5 grievances filed by each member, which is a phenomenal amount of grievances handled by any union in Canada. And the main reason for this huge amount of grievances is the fact that the employer never intended to live up to the collective agreement from the time that he signed it in 1975. He has made the union and the union members fight for every gain that was made in that collective agreement. And this has been tremendous cost to the union and a tremendous cost to the Treasury Board, who eventually handles the grievances when they go to adjudication. But it seems that they have unlimited sources of money because they're handling the taxpayers' money.
The government seems to have unlimited funds when it's a question of backing up violations of the collective agreement. But when it comes to basic and long-standing issues, such as the noise problem in automated plants, the government does nothing.
The union has, ever since automation began to be introduced, has put forward the demand that there be noise level testings and visual testing in the post office. In fact, what's happened is that we've had to set up our own tests because of the refusal of management to participate. There is a considerable debate among safety experts on what is a reasonable, a decent noise level, but it clearly is much, much lower than management would accept.
This is Canada's largest mail sorting plant. If you were working in this building, this is what you would hear. As a result of public pressure, the government has commissioned numerous studies inquiring into the problems of the post office. All these studies, such as the Montpetit, Blueprint for Change, and Anderson reports, have blamed management for inefficiency and discontent. These studies were shelved or suppressed. The reports recommended turning the post office into a Crown corporation and doing so before major changes like automation were introduced. Since 1947, the union has been saying the same thing.
The Post Office Department as such doesn't have a mandate to institute improved services or expand on existing services because of the political interference, because of restraints in the overall government. And the institution of a Crown Corporation would improve the service, expand the mandate of the Post Office Department if it was a Crown Corporation, and lead ultimately to better labor relations, which would put the employees under the Canada Labor Code.
In the spring of 1977, 3 months before the expiry of their contract, the union requested that negotiations begin for a new agreement. They met with the Treasury Board.
Par le Conseil du Trésor, il n'y a aucun doute, n'est pas prêt à négocier avec ses employés, malgré que...
Treasury Board, there's no doubt, is not ready to negotiate with its employees. When we sit at the bargaining table, it doesn't take time to find out that for the employer we have 4 types of demands. First, we have the demands that, according to the employer, are not negotiable under the law. Then there are the demands that the employer considers to be management rights, therefore is not ready to discuss them. Also, there are the demands that affect all the federal public service, Therefore, they say they should be discussed within a consultation committee with the other unions outside the bargaining table. For the demands left, the employer tells us they are not negotiable, they are too complex, and should be referred to consultation committees to be dealt with after negotiations. And finally, we end up with a situation where if we were to listen to the employer, our collective agreement would be full of committees without solutions to the problems we raise at the bargaining table.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a question for the Postmaster General. Will the Postmaster General confirm a report that was made on the weekend that the Post, since the termination of their contract, which was almost a year ago today, the Post Office has not made, at least up until the weekend, a single new proposal in its negotiations with CUPW?
Mr. Speaker, it is very easy to say that we haven't made any proposition to the CUPW.
Le ministère des Postes est si dur avec le syndicat en négociation, car les postiers sont responsables du droit à négociation et du droit de grève dans toute la fonction publique fédérale.
The reason the Postmaster General takes a hard line in negotiations is because postal workers are responsible for the right to negotiate and the right to strike in the federal public sector. We must also remember that the postal workers succeeded in making numerous breakthroughs in areas that were considered non-negotiable. In particular, in 1975, we won rights in the areas of transfers, classification, job security, and casual workers. It's also important to remember that postal workers were the first victims of the Anti-Inflation Board in 1975, and that the government had to make an exception to its anti-inflation legislation. In fact, the Treasury Board is afraid that these gains will serve as a precedent for other workers.
The government never negotiated really with us at any time. They always had some excuse. Sometimes they would say it's against the law. Sometimes they would say, no, that's not covered in the Act. We can't discuss that. It's not negotiable.
To realize that we're having at the same time.
At first, it appeared that the attitude of the government was following the familiar pattern. No negotiations until the union went out on strike. The Postmaster General gave assurances that at least the right to strike would be respected.
And the right to strike? Can you believe that in 1978? That would cure it all? There would be no slowdown. There would be no illegal strike because we banned the strike.
At midnight on October 16, 1978, after more than a year and a half of conciliation and negotiation, postal workers once again were forced to go on strike to get a contract. One day later, the Canadian government introduced Bill C-8, taking away the postal workers' right to strike.
We're sowing the seeds of discontent for years to come. And it's quite possible this Parliament, if it passes this legislation, will sour the possibilities of success for a Crown Corporation in years to come, because the trust is not being built. All we're doing is we're institutionalizing the distrust and the anger of these workers in the post office.
La question est la suivante, Monsieur.
The question is the following. Monsieur Ouellet, seconded by Mr. Andrus, proposes Bill C-8, an act for the resumption and continuation of postal services, be now read a second time and referred to Committee of the Whole.
Of the motion will please rise.
In the space of a few moments, the members of Parliament passed Bill C-8. The only political party that voted against this legislation was the NDP. Bill C-8 also imposed compulsory arbitration, giving the government an opportunity to institute rollbacks of rights and protections contained in the old collective agreement. While Bill C-8 was directed at postal workers, it also sent a message to the whole trade union movement. This is what your rights mean to us.
Mr. Watson. Mr. Watson. Mr. Claremont.
Monsieur Claremont.
And when postal workers decided to maintain their right to strike, the government sent in the RCMP to raid their offices and arrest their leaders.
There seems to be two laws in this country. When the RCMP opened the mail illegally, the government said they're going to pass a legislation to make it legal. But when postal workers legally go on strike, they pass a legislation to make it illegal.
The union and the members of the National Executive were charged under the Criminal Code of Canada with defying a statute of Parliament. Their crime, defending the rights of working people.
Well, here we are at the courthouse waiting for John Claude's, the decision on John Claude. This is the type of negotiations that the post office do. They don't negotiate at the table. They make the law and the courts work for them. They don't want to live with a contract. They have their own ideas of what it should be. And even although they go through the procedure as far as time is concerned, they really don't negotiate in a true fact.
Struggle is the struggle of the whole trade union movement, because if the rights of this union are taken away in this manner, who will be next? Will it be us, or will it be someone in the private sector?
Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever for the union.
The role of solidarity in any dispute is absolutely essential. There are 24,000 members in that union who have waged a tremendous battle for a collective agreement and for the protection of their rights to bargain and whatever. I think solidarity is absolutely essential, but I think that the postal workers have been getting something less than that. And I think that the labor movement is going to have to take a real look at this thing, whether it can afford to sit back. I think it better get its act together and show solidarity for the postal workers like has never been demonstrated in this country before.
Just because in one round of negotiation, the government have used all its power, including using the courts, the RCMP, the special legislation, the attitude of postal workers won't change. Well, there's no doubt in my mind there is more solidarity than ever among postal workers. We'll get ready for the next round of negotiation and make sure we'll get all these rights back.
Just before Christmas, I was out shopping, and I had occasion as I was shopping to use a credit card, and a man said to me, "Well, who do you work for?" I said, "The Canadian Union of Postal Workers." "You don't work for the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, do you?" And I said, "Yeah. As a matter of fact," I said, "I'm an education officer. I really do work for the union." He said, "Well, you're buying Christmas presents." I said, "Well, why wouldn't I? I mean, what am I? I mean, you know," I said, "You won't believe this, but I'm married. I have 3 children. I go to church on Sundays when I'm home." I said, "You know, I lead a pretty regular life." I said, "That's what we are. We're 23,000, and that's what we are. We don't walk around with big, long black coats and meet in the back of a room and discuss ways of trying to gouge the government and gouge the public. That's not what we're doing." We are just regular, everyday. That's all we do. We're just workers looking to better our lot in life. That's all we want.
The union is behind us. We shall not be moved. The union is behind us. We shall not be moved, just like a tree that's standing by the water. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved, just like a tree that's standing by the water.